The Appalachians in 1895 were a world apart, vast, wild, and unkind to those who didn't respect them. The mountain air carried the weight of silence, broken only by the low moan of wind cutting through pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling something it would never reach. In winter, when the trees turned skeletal and snow buried the old trails, the land became something else entirely, something that didn't forgive. It was in those months that 8 trappers vanished, leaving behind their camps still warm, their rifles propped against tree trunks and pelts laid out as if waiting for trade. Before their disappearance, the men were known by name in the nearby towns, rugged, stubborn souls who made a living where few dared to linger. They weren't rich, but they carried a kind of pride that only those who survived off the land could understand. Their hands were calloused, their faces carved by cold and sun, and their eyes always held a watchfulness that came from living too close to nature's edge. Each man had his own reason for being out there that winter: money, escape, pride, or something darker that nobody cared to name. That year had started strangely. Locals spoke of animals acting wrong, tracks that led nowhere, howls at night that didn't sound like wolves, and birds falling quiet for hours at a time. Old folks in town said the mountains were shifting, angry maybe, or waking up after a long sleep. But the younger men, the trappers especially, laughed at the stories. They believed in what they could see and shoot, not in old wives' tales whispered beside dying fires. They left in late November when the snow first began to crust over the hills. They split into pairs, setting their camps miles apart along the ridges, following rivers and old trap lines that had been used for generations. The last anyone saw of them was at the trading post, a wooden shack that smelled of tobacco and pelts. The storekeeper, a man named Whitlock, said they'd seemed eager but uneasy, their laughter forced, their movements quick. One of them, a tall man with a scar under his eye, had asked if anyone had seen strange lights above the ridge 2 nights earlier. Whitlock hadn't, but he remembered the look on the man's face, a mix of fear and curiosity he couldn't quite name. Life in those parts didn't stop for worry. People vanished sometimes, lost to the cold, to a bear, or to madness. But this felt different. The trappers knew the land too well to all vanish at once. That winter was harsher than usual, and every creak of ice or distant echo seemed to carry meaning. The mountains were too quiet, the way a room feels after someone died in it. Each man had a small story trailing behind him, like a shadow that grew longer the deeper he went into the woods. There was Isaac, who'd been a hunter since he was old enough to hold a rifle, a widower who spent more nights in the forest than in his cabin. Then there were the Wilkes brothers, James and Eli, who were said to fight like dogs but never left each other's side. Another, Frank Leary, had once been a preacher before something broke in him and sent him chasing the solitude of the wild. Together they were bound by need and habit, not by friendship. The mountains had a way of testing men like them. Long nights around the fire turned to silence when the wind changed direction. They spoke little, slept lightly, and watched the shadows stretch and move as if the forest itself breathed. Some said they heard laughter in the distance, high, cold, and not quite human. Others claimed to see lanterns swinging between the trees, though no one was there to hold them. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the camps had already gone still. Before that, the trappers' lives seemed almost ordinary in their rough way. They traded pelts for salt, whiskey, and bullets. They knew every shortcut through the ridges and could tell the weather by the color of the sky. But underneath that simple rhythm was something fragile, a quiet unease that no one named. Some of them had debts, others had enemies, and a few had secrets too heavy to leave behind. In the towns below the mountains, people whispered that the men had stumbled into something they shouldn't have, something buried deep and old, hidden beneath layers of soil and silence. Some believed they'd gone mad, turned on each other. Others thought it was the land itself that took them, reclaiming what had always been hers. But some details didn't fit either story. When searchers went looking weeks later, they found campfires still smoldering, bedrolls still warm, and food half-cooked in pans. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away, just emptiness. It was as if they had stepped out of the world all at once, leaving behind the shape of their lives but not their souls. The snow had begun to fall again by then, soft and relentless, covering everything that might have told what happened. The only things left untouched were the pelts, neatly arranged, ready for trade as if the men meant to return before night fell. But night did fall and the mountains swallowed the rest. People would come to call it a curse, though no one knew what kind. It started with simple words spoken over whiskey glasses in dim-lit bars. But the stories grew as they always do. And in those dark Appalachian winters, when the wind howled just right, folks swore they could still hear voices echoing through the pines. 8 men laughing quietly as if they still sat around their fires, unaware they were already gone. By early December, the cold had turned cruel, the kind that bit into bone and made breath hang like ghosts in the air. The 8 trappers were spread across the upper ridge of the Appalachians, a stretch of land few dared to cross even in summer. The snow had begun to bury the forest floor, and the silence was so complete it pressed against their thoughts. At first, it was just the weather, just another hard season. But then things began to shift, quietly, like a knife being drawn behind someone's back. Isaac noticed it first. His traps were being moved, sometimes sprung with no animal inside, sometimes gone altogether. At first, he thought it was animals or thieves, but the footprints he found around his camp were odd, bare, small, and uneven, as if someone had walked there without shoes. He followed them once, deep into the trees, until they vanished beside a frozen creek. When he told the Wilkes brothers, they laughed it off. "Maybe your ghosts want pelts too," Eli joked, but even as he said it, his eyes kept darting toward the tree line. James Wilkes had been acting strange himself. He'd started talking to someone at night, low murmurs by the fire when he thought Eli was asleep. His brother heard the whispering once, though he couldn't make out the words. When he asked James about it the next morning, James only stared at him, jaw tight, and said, "You heard the wind." After that, Eli didn't bring it up again. But the unease between them started to grow like frost spreading across glass. Frank Leary, the former preacher, kept a small leather Bible in his coat pocket. He'd begun writing inside it again, long passages that didn't read like scripture anymore. The other men noticed how he'd started praying before setting his traps, mumbling something under his breath as if trying to bargain with the land itself. When Isaac asked him what he was saying, Frank looked up, eyes hollow, and said, "Not prayers, promises." No one asked him what that meant. By mid-December, the food had started running low. Their usual hunting routes were barren, no deer, no rabbits, not even birds. The forest felt empty. Every sound was sharper, and every shadow seemed to hold something just out of sight. The men began meeting once a week to share supplies and talk, but those gatherings turned tense. Accusations started small, someone not pulling his weight, someone taking extra jerky, someone stealing traps. Then came the shouting, the pushing, and the long silences afterward when no one looked each other in the eye. Money was on everyone's mind. That winter's haul was supposed to be their biggest yet, pelts meant for a new trading contract that promised enough profit to last them all year. They'd been counting on it. But as the weeks dragged on and their catches shrank, desperation set in. Isaac wanted to move camps to follow the river south where the snow wasn't so deep. James refused. He said the ridge still had promise and that leaving would mean losing everything they'd already worked for. Their argument ended with Isaac storming off into the woods, muttering that the mountain could have the rest of them. Eli tried to keep the peace, but even he wasn't the same. He started hearing things at night, cries, sometimes laughter, sometimes the sound of boots crunching in the snow outside his tent. He'd rush out with his rifle only to find nothing there. Once he thought he saw a figure standing between the trees, a woman long-haired and barefoot watching him. But when he blinked, she was gone. He told no one. The others already thought he was soft. Down the ridge, 2 other trappers, Roe and Tanner, had begun keeping to themselves. They didn't trust the others, especially after one of their snares was found torn apart as if by human hands. Roe had a temper and Tanner had a secret, a wife and 2 daughters back home who thought he'd quit trapping years ago. He was deep in debt to a trader in town, and this expedition was supposed to fix everything. The pressure ate at him, twisting his nerves until every sound set him on edge. When Roe joked one night about splitting the profits and running, Tanner didn't laugh. He just stared at the fire and said quietly, "We can't run from what's out here." It wasn't just paranoia anymore. The men began finding things left around their camps, pieces of fur tied together with twine, crude symbols carved into tree bark, and once a deer skull placed neatly beside a tent, its eye sockets packed with snow. No footprints, no explanation. Frank said it was a warning. Isaac said it was a joke, but deep down, none of them really believed that. The nights stretched longer. They started sleeping in pairs again, too uneasy to be alone. But even then, sleep didn't come easily. The wind would rise suddenly, carrying voices that sounded almost human. More than once, someone woke up to find their fire burned low and their supplies scattered as if something, or someone, had been searching through them. James began to change. His eyes grew darker, sunken, and his hands shook when he loaded his rifle. Eli caught him once, crouched by the fire in the middle of the night, carving something into a piece of wood. When he asked what it was, James snapped, "You wouldn't understand." He hid it under his bedroll, but later Eli found it. A small figure made from branches and twine shaped like a man. It had no face. Then one morning, Roe didn't show up at the meeting point. The others searched his camp and found his traps still hanging untouched. His bedroll was laid out, his food half-eaten. His rifle leaned against a tree. No footprints were leading away, just snow, smooth and untouched. Tanner refused to stay another night after that. He packed his gear, saying he'd head back down the mountain alone, but he never made it. Days later, his sled dogs returned to camp without him, their harnesses torn and their fur stiff with ice. After that, something broke in the group. They stopped talking about the disappearances and started pretending nothing was wrong. It was easier that way. The fear was too big to name. Frank kept writing in his Bible, his entries now frantic and uneven, full of words that didn't make sense. The snow listens, the air remembers, the mountain eats. Isaac found the pages once and burned them, saying they'd only make things worse. Food was nearly gone by January. The cold was merciless and the men were thinner, meaner. Every conversation turned sharp. One night, after hours of silence, Eli accused Isaac of stealing jerky from his pack. Isaac denied it, but the anger between them had been building for weeks. The fight turned violent fast, fists, blood, shouting. It only ended when James stepped in, holding his rifle. His voice was calm when he said, "The mountain's taking one of us soon, you'll see." No one answered. They just sat there, staring at the fire, each man lost in his own fear. In the days that followed, a heavy fog rolled in, swallowing the forest whole. Visibility dropped to nothing. Their compasses stopped working. It was as if the mountain itself had shifted, erasing the paths they'd always known. The men began marking trees with knife cuts to find their way back, but sometimes those marks disappeared overnight. By now, none of them trusted each other. Isaac swore he saw Eli talking to someone in the dark. Frank said James had been sleepwalking, wandering off and coming back with frost on his face and no memory of where he'd been. More strange sounds filled the nights, low chanting, sometimes laughter, sometimes a woman's hum, soft and far away. They started keeping watch in turns, rifles loaded, eyes burning from lack of sleep. The last night they were seen together, a storm hit. Snow came down heavily, wind tearing through the trees like a scream. Inside their tents, the men argued about leaving. James refused. "If we move now, the mountain will finish us," he said. Isaac cursed him, shouting that they were already finished. Eli tried to pull them apart, but the shouting drowned everything else. Frank started praying again, his words fevered, his hands shaking. Then the wind rose higher, and for a moment they all froze because beneath it they heard something else. A voice, soft, singing, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. James stepped out first, clutching his rifle, and disappeared into the snow. Eli called after him, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. One by one the others followed, drawn by something none of them could explain. The fires were left burning, the tents half open, the food still cooking. When the storm passed by morning, only silence remained. No one knows what they found out there, or what found them, but the snow around the camps was untouched, as if no one had ever walked away. The pelts lay stacked neatly by the fires, still warm beneath the falling snow. The night the mountain finally took them was colder than any before. The air hung heavy, so still it felt alive. The sky was buried under clouds, and the forest glowed faintly with reflected snowlight, the kind of dim blue that blurs the line between waking and dream. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was worse. A silence that hummed, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The fires in the trappers' camps burned low, orange cracks in the dark, and the men, hollow-eyed and sleepless, sat scattered around them, watching the flames like they were waiting for something. Isaac's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He had barely eaten in 2 days, and the cold gnawed at his insides. He kept his rifle across his knees, thumb tracing the iron sights over and over. Every time the wind moved, his body tensed. It wasn't the cold that bothered him anymore, it was the feeling that they were being watched. The others felt it too, though no one dared say it. Frank's lips moved in a whisper that sounded like prayer, but his eyes were wide and wild. James Wilkes stood at the edge of camp, staring into the dark tree line, still as a statue. His brother Eli called to him softly, but James didn't answer. When the singing started, it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A woman's voice, distant but clear, carried through the trees. It was soft, almost kind, humming a tune that didn't belong in this world. The men froze, even the fire seemed to shrink from the sound. Isaac muttered a curse and gripped his rifle tighter. Eli stood, calling out into the dark, "Who's there?" No reply. Just the song, slow and steady, growing a little louder, a little closer. James took a step forward. His face looked calm, almost peaceful, as if the sound had reached some hidden part of him. Eli grabbed his arm. "Don't," he hissed, but James shook him off. "You hear it, don't you?" James whispered. "She's calling." His voice cracked. "She knows." Before anyone could stop him, he stepped into the snow, walking toward the trees. Isaac shouted after him, but James didn't turn. Eli ran after his brother, stumbling through the snow. The others hesitated for a moment, then followed, drawn by fear or something they couldn't explain. The singing kept pulling them forward, threading through the forest like a lure. The air felt wrong, thicker, colder, heavy with something that didn't belong there. They found James standing in a clearing surrounded by trees blackened by fire long ago. In the center was a circle of stones, half buried in snow, and inside that circle lay bones, animal, maybe human, it was hard to tell. James had fallen to his knees, his rifle dropped at his side. Eli was behind him, shouting for him to get up, but James only laughed, low and strange, like he'd finally understood something no one else could. Frank stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We shouldn't be here." But even as he spoke, the wind shifted and the song turned into something else, something broken, stretched, almost like laughter. It came from the trees all around them. Then just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt alive. Eli reached for his brother again, but James jerked away, turning to face him. His eyes looked wrong, dilated, glassy, and full of something that wasn't him. "You don't hear it," he said. "You never did." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "She's been waiting." Eli took a step back. "Who?" James smiled, slow and strange. "The mountain." He moved so fast that no one had time to react. His hand darted for his rifle, but Eli grabbed him, and the two brothers crashed into the snow, shouting, thrashing. The others shouted too, running forward, but the chaos swallowed everything. Their yells, the crunch of snow, the sound of metal against skin. A gun went off. Then another. Isaac saw the flash, brief, blinding, and when it faded, Eli was on his back, blood spreading dark through the snow. James stood over him, breathing hard, the rifle shaking in his hands. The look on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was confusion, sorrow, like he'd just woken up from a dream he didn't want to be in. He dropped the rifle. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. She said it had to be done." Eli tried to speak, but only blood came out. Frank rushed forward, shouting James's name, but the other man stumbled back, eyes darting toward the trees. "She's still here," James said. "She's watching." Then the forest erupted. The wind roared through the clearing, and the trees began to groan, their branches creaking like bones. Snow whipped through the air so thick that they could barely see. Something moved between the trunks, shadows, dozens of them, circling, closing in. Isaac fired into the dark again and again, the sound cracking through the storm. Frank dropped to his knees beside Eli, pressing his hands against the wound, but it was useless. Eli's eyes stared past him, glassy and still. Rose's voice came from somewhere in the white blur, shouting, "Run!" But there was nowhere to go. The figures were closer now, bare shapes, pale and twisting. They looked human but wrong. Their movements didn't match the snow beneath them, as if they weren't bound by the same earth. Isaac turned to fire again, but one of them was already there. A hand, cold, dry, colorless, grabbed his wrist. The touch burned like ice. He screamed and fell backward, his rifle dropping into the snow. James stood unmoving, his face calm as the figures reached him. He whispered something none of the others could hear. Then he stepped forward into their arms, disappearing into the storm. Frank ran. He didn't look back. He stumbled through the woods, branches clawing his face, his breath tearing from his lungs. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The wind screamed around him, carrying voices that weren't his own. He tripped over a root, fell hard, and when he pushed himself up, he realized the forest had gone silent again. He turned, expecting to see the others behind him, but there was nothing. No figures, no firelight, no sound. Only the soft fall of snow covered his tracks. He stood there for a long time, gasping until the cold began to bite through his clothes. His hands were bleeding, his face numb, and something inside him had broken loose. Back at the camp, the fires still burned. The tents flapped in the wind, their flaps open, snow gathering on bedrolls and supplies. The pelts were laid out in perfect rows beside the flames, untouched, as if someone had carefully arranged them. There were no footprints in the snow, no blood, no bodies. By morning, the wind had covered everything. The forest looked untouched, clean, innocent. Only a few scattered things remained, a rifle half buried in the snow, a torn piece of cloth, a Bible with pages frozen together. On one of the pages, scrawled in uneven writing, were 3 words, "She is hungry." Frank was found days later, wandering miles from the ridge, barefoot and half-mad. His mind was gone. He mumbled about the singing, about the mountain's voice, about how it doesn't take what's dead, it takes what's warm. When the search party brought him down to town, he kept asking for fire. "Keep it burning," he'd whisper, "or she'll come through the dark." He died that night in his sleep, his hands still black with frostbite. When they sent another party up to find the rest, all they found were the campfires still warm, meals half-cooked, and traps still hanging. The snow was smooth all around. Not a single track led away. It was as if the men had stood up, walked into the cold, and vanished into thin air. And maybe they had. Because sometimes in those mountains, when the wind turns strange and the snow falls too quietly, people swear they can hear a voice. A soft one, sweet and low, singing an old tune. And if you listen too long, you might just follow it, just like they did. When the storm finally cleared, the mountain looked peaceful again, untouched, almost beautiful. The snow shimmered under the weak sunlight, hiding everything it had swallowed. The search party that climbed up from the valley a week later wasn't expecting to find much. They'd heard stories of missing trappers before, men caught in avalanches, frozen where they stood, buried by time. But what they found that morning unsettled even the most hardened among them. The first camp they reached still smelled faintly of smoke. The fire pit was warm to the touch, though the wood had burned down to ash. Half-cooked meat sat in a pan, blackened from the heat. The bedrolls were laid out neatly, and the pelts, beautiful, thick winter furs, were stacked beside them as if ready for trade. But there was no one there. No tracks, no blood, no sign of struggle, just silence, heavy and absolute. One of the searchers, a man named Robert Carlson, later told townsfolk that it felt wrong to stand there, like they were trespassing on something sacred or cursed. He said the air itself felt thick, hard to breathe, and though the trees were still, he swore he could hear faint laughter somewhere deep in the woods. The others didn't hear it, but they could see the fear on his face. They found the other camps in the same state. Fires still burning, supplies untouched, everything arranged too perfectly. It was as if the men had vanished mid-breath. The searchers spread out, calling names into the cold air, their voices bouncing off the cliffs and dying in the fog. Nothing answered back. When they brought word back to town, no one believed them at first. People said it was impossible. 8 men couldn't just disappear. But when the rescuers brought back the evidence, their belongings, the rifles, the pelts, and that Bible with the frozen pages, something shifted in the town. Fear crept in quietly like frost under a door. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew something was wrong with that mountain. The families of the missing men didn't handle it well. Isaac's wife refused to believe he was dead. She stood by the trading post for weeks, waiting for him to return, certain he'd walk in with that same tired smile and his pack full of furs. When the first thaw came and no trace of him appeared, she stopped speaking altogether. She moved to her sister's farm a few towns over, where she spent the rest of her days sitting by the window, watching the hills. The Wilkes family took it harder. Their father, already frail, broke completely when he learned both sons were gone. He'd lost his wife the winter before, and the boys had been all he had left. He didn't eat for days, just sat by the fire with their old photographs. He kept saying the same thing over and over. They promised they'd be back before spring. When the snows melted, he rode up the ridge himself, hopping to find anything, bones, a rifle, a sign. He came back 3 days later, white as chalk, refusing to speak of what he saw. As for Frank Leary, his story spread the fastest. He'd been found alive, wandering barefoot through the snow, rambling nonsense about the mountain's hunger and the voice of a woman singing in the trees. At first, people pitied him. They said the cold had broken his mind, that he was delirious. But when he died that same night, the pity turned to fear. The doctor who examined him said there was no clear cause, his heart had simply stopped. But his face was frozen in an expression no one could describe, eyes wide open, mouth half smiling, as if he'd seen something no one else could. Rumors spread quickly after that. The townsfolk said the trappers had dug into something sacred, disturbed something ancient that should have been left alone. Some said it was spirits, those buried under old lands, watching, waiting. Others blamed the men themselves, saying greed or madness had driven them to turn on each other. The stories changed with every telling. The only thing that stayed the same was that name whispered around every table, the mountain. By spring, no one dared trap near that ridge anymore. Hunters avoided it, even the desperate ones. A few strangers came through asking questions, reporters from far-off cities, men with notebooks and too much curiosity. They spoke to the locals, walked the trails, and even visited the camps. One of them wrote that it was the eeriest place east of the Rockies, a landscape that feels aware of you. His editor never published the story. The town didn't want attention. They wanted to forget, but forgetting never came easy. People swore they saw lights on the ridge some nights, dim orange flickers that looked like campfires. When they went closer, there was nothing there. Children born years later grew up hearing the stories, told in hushed voices by firelight. "Don't wander past the ridge," the parents would warn. That's where the mountain sings. Whitlock, the old storekeeper who'd been the last to see the men alive, carried guilt that never left him. He remembered their faces that night, their unease, the forced laughter, the fear behind their eyes. He thought about stopping them, telling them to wait until spring, but he hadn't. Men like that don't listen, he'd told himself. But years later, when he was old and mostly blind, he'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain he heard footsteps outside his shop, boots crunching softly in the snow, stopping right by his door. When he opened it, no one was ever there. The government sent investigators once, years after the fact. They tried to make sense of it, bringing maps and notebooks, asking questions about wildlife, weather, and terrain. They blamed the cold, maybe a landslide, maybe starvation, but nothing fit. The official report called it an unexplained disappearance. The locals just called it cursed. In the years that followed, the story turned into legend. The 8 lost trappers of 1895 became a warning, a ghost story passed from mouth to mouth. But for those who had known them, it wasn't just a story. It was a wound that never healed. Isaac's wife died believing he was still up there somewhere. The Wilkes family left town for good. The preacher's Bible, still stained with frost, stayed locked away in the sheriff's office until it went missing one night, no one was sure when. Even decades later, strange things kept happening near that ridge. Hikers went missing. Hunters heard singing when the wind blew a certain way. A few who returned swore they'd seen shapes moving in the snow, 8 of them, walking in a line, silent, faces turned toward the trees. The town learned to live with it. They built new roads, opened new shops, and spoke less about the old days. But on winter nights, when the sky turned the color of steel and the air grew still, people still lit candles by their windows. Not out of superstition, but out of respect, for the men who had gone up the mountain and never came back. Some said the land took them, others said they gave themselves to it. But those who truly knew the mountains, the ones who had felt their weight and silence, understood that it didn't matter which was true. The Appalachians didn't take, they kept. And once you belonged to them, you never really left. Years after the snow had covered the last of their tracks, the story of the 8 missing trappers still echoed across the Appalachian ridges like a warning whispered by the wind. The woods that once felt alive with the hum of work, the cutting of hides, the crackle of campfires, the laughter of men surviving the wilderness, had gone silent. No one went that deep anymore. The ground where their camps once stood now lay untouched, as if the mountain itself had decided to bury its secret. By spring of 1896, local lawmen and volunteers had scoured every known trapping route. What they found were fragments, a torn glove frozen stiff beside a stream, a rusted rifle half buried in ice, and camps that looked as if the men had simply stepped away mid-conversation. Their fires were still warm when first discovered. The pelts, some still drying on stretched frames, were fresh. Coffee pots sat half full. It was as if time had stopped, except for the missing men. When the search parties finally gave up, the questions didn't stop. Newspapers wrote about the vanishing trappers of Black Hollow Ridge. Some said they were taken by something wild. Others believed they turned on each other, driven mad by the isolation, greed, or guilt. And then some whispered about the mountain's curse, the same one old settlers spoke of, but no one dared name aloud. Sheriff Amos Ridley, who led the search, carried the case like a stone in his chest. He'd spent nights replaying the evidence, the strange patterns left in the snow, the way all 8 campsites were found with everything perfectly in place except for the men themselves. He often thought of the youngest trapper, Eli Boone, barely 21, who had written a letter to his mother days before disappearing. In it, he mentioned strange sounds outside the tents, low voices like men talking, though no one could find where they came from. "They don't sound close, Ma," he wrote, "but they ain't far either." In the years that followed, the families of the missing men broke under the weight of not knowing. Wives who waited too long eventually remarried. Parents died, never learning what became of their sons. Some of the families took to blaming each other, certain that greed or betrayal had played a role. A few accused the sheriff of covering something up, but Amos knew there was nothing left to hide, only the truth that no one could explain. Decades later, when surveyors returned to the ridge to map new logging paths, they stumbled upon something strange. A circle of trees unnaturally bent inward, as if pressed by great weight, their roots twisted into the shape of a spiral. In the center of that spiral lay bones, too many for one man, too few for 8. The discovery reignited old fears, and soon the small towns along the Appalachian border were filled with the same hushed talk from years before. No one could tell what exactly happened to those men, but everyone agreed on one thing: the mountain kept what it wanted. The official reports spoke of exposure, maybe a storm, perhaps wild animals. But those who knew the forest best, old hunters, moonshiners, trappers who'd lived their whole lives in the shadow of those peaks, knew better. They said there are things in those woods older than any man's name, things that don't care for human company. The case remained unsolved. Time eroded the names and faces of the missing, but their story became part of the mountain's legend, woven into its soil and fog. Children grew up hearing it by firelight, parents warning them never to wander too far where the pines grew thickest. Sheriff Ridley died in 1912, never finding peace. In his final days, he told his daughter that the night before he ended the last search, he saw something he'd never spoken of before: 8 sets of footprints leading out of the camp and into the woods, side by side, each one sinking deeper into the snow until they simply stopped. No sign of struggle, no blood, just silence. He said he followed the prints until he could no longer feel his legs. Then he heard laughter, not mocking, not fearful, just low and strange, as if it belonged to men who were no longer. He turned back, knowing some truths weren't meant for the living. The disappearance of the 8 trappers became more than a mystery. It became a reflection of how little control humans have over the wild and over themselves. It showed how greed, fear, and pride could blind even the toughest men. And as time passed, the story became less about the missing and more about what they represented. How quickly civilization fades when you're alone with your thoughts, your hunger, and your guilt. The people of those hills came to see the story as both a warning and a truth. Some places are not meant to be claimed. Justice never came, not in any form that fit the world of laws or courts. But perhaps justice belonged to the mountains, and maybe that was enough. In the end, the ridge remained what it always had been: cold, quiet, and watchful. The trees whispered when the wind passed through, and travelers said if you listened closely, you could still hear men talking softly in the distance, their voices tangled in the rustle of branches. No one ever knew what they were saying, but maybe they weren't speaking to us at all.